The prosecutor's question wasn't just procedural. It was a pivot point. Jasmine Crockett opened her folder, found the graph she had prepared, and began laying out her findings. The board, once skeptical, now leaned forward. She pointed to case records, pulled from public filings, and walked them through sentencing discrepancies. How similar offenses yielded wildly different outcomes based on the defendant's race. How cash bail was weaponized against the poor. How nonviolent offenses became long-term detainments, all under the same judge's gavel. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. One chart showed that out of 117 minor probation violations in a 6-month period, 83% of the individuals given extended jail time were black. Another chart showed the judge's own commentary, handwritten annotations where he described one young man's tone as defiant, even though no such behavior was documented anywhere else in the transcript. Words like uncooperative, hostile, dangerous, words not tied to evidence, but to impressions. And then, the silence in the room shifted from tension to discomfort. The judge who had so confidently labeled Jasmine a performer now sat with his head slightly bowed, one hand clasped tightly in the other. She wasn't there to be liked. She was there to illuminate. And nothing she said could be dismissed now, not because of her title, but because the receipts spoke louder than any insult. The media coverage outside the hearing had ballooned by that point. Every outlet had dispatched reporters, and social media was spinning live clips. The initial moment, the insult and the silence, had already gone viral. But what came next mattered more. Because this wasn't about a clapback. It was about a collapse. The collapse of the facade that had protected men like that judge for decades. The collapse of the idea that emotional intelligence and raw passion equaled weakness. The collapse of decorum used as a weapon against truth. Crockett was prepared for the moment when a board member attempted to steer the conversation back toward procedure. She calmly interrupted. With respect, she said, procedure without integrity is performance. What we're discussing is not a technicality, it's a pattern. A pattern that devastates families and erodes public trust. And then she told the story of Jamal Wexler. Jamal had been arrested during a traffic stop. The charge was resisting arrest, though body cam footage showed no such thing. The real reason, he asked why he was being pulled over. The same judge presiding over this hearing denied him bond 3 times, citing risk to the community. That risk was never explained. He missed his daughter's first steps, missed his father's funeral, all because he couldn't afford $2,500 in bail. When Jasmine read the judge's original remarks about Jamal, he seems to carry a chip on his shoulder, the room fell completely quiet again. She closed the folder, and she said simply, this system will keep eating people like Jamal, until we decide that commentary without accountability has consequences. It wasn't just testimony anymore. It was indictment. The chair of the review board, the same one who had tried to dismiss her, cleared his throat and attempted to regain control. He offered a question that sounded more like a defense. You understand that the judge has discretionary power under the statute, correct? Jasmine turned, held his gaze, and replied, yes. And discretion is not immunity. Discretion is a responsibility. And when it's abused repeatedly, especially in racially biased patterns, it ceases to be discretion and becomes discrimination. At that point, we're no longer discussing law. We're discussing injustice dressed in legalese. It wasn't grandstanding. It was clarity. Precision. Legal truth without compromise. The second half of the hearing was no longer about her performance. It was about theirs, the way the system had performed neutrality while inflicting harm. The way a judge had performed fairness while leaving young men behind bars for months without charges. The way oversight boards had performed diligence while ignoring cries from families for years. By the time her testimony ended, even those who came into the hearing prepared to discredit her found themselves scribbling notes furiously. Some whispered to staffers. One board member openly requested follow-up data from her office. The judge didn't request another chance to speak. He stayed silent. When she left the hearing room, the press was already waiting outside. Cameras rolled. Microphones were thrust forward. Reporters asked questions rapid fire. Congresswoman, how do you respond to being called a performer? Do you think this hearing will result in the judge's removal? Are you planning to file further action? She paused before answering. "I don't need to respond to an insult when the evidence speaks for itself," she said. "This isn't about me. This is about a system that uses language to deflect from harm. I'll keep showing up. Whether people call it a performance or not, that doesn't change the facts." And then she walked away. That's when the silence came again. Not just in the courtroom, but on Capitol Hill, in media circles, in judicial oversight committees. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just delivered a testimony. She'd issued a challenge. What happens when the people we call performers turn out to be the only ones telling the truth? What happens when labels can't contain the force of facts? What happens when the silence after an insult becomes the loudest moment in the room? In the days that followed, articles poured in. Editorials split down partisan lines. But the footage, raw, uninterrupted, was everywhere. Not just the moment she was insulted, but the long stare that followed. The pause, the discipline, the clarity. Clips from that day were played in classrooms. Law schools broke it down in lectures. Activists turned her quotes into rallying cries. And quietly, behind closed doors, conversations shifted. Judicial accountability, once a back-burner issue, was suddenly front page again. People started asking harder questions about how judges are reviewed, how patterns are documented, how systems shield the powerful. Not just because of what Crockett said, but because of what she didn't say. She didn't meet insult with insult. She met it with facts, with stories, with truth. And truth has a way of echoing, long after the microphones are turned off. In the following weeks, calls for the judge's resignation grew louder. A coalition of civil rights groups filed a formal ethics complaint. More families came forward. And the silence, it began to break, but not the way people expected. Because Jasmine didn't return to Twitter with a viral thread. She didn't go on a press tour. She didn't write a takedown op-ed. She went back to work, held a town hall, sat with mothers, filed another inquiry, showed up to another oversight committee, this time for a different issue, in a different state. Quietly, steadily, with purpose. Because when someone calls you just a performer, the most powerful response isn't fury. It's consistency. It's truth that doesn't flinch. And that's the lesson most people missed. Being visible isn't the same as being loud. And being loud isn't the same as being hollow. Sometimes, the loudest moment in a room is the one where you say nothing. Where you let your silence point the mirror back at your accuser. Where you give people the space to hear their own echo, and realize it doesn't stand up. And that's what Jasmine Crockett did. She turned the insult into an indictment. She turned the performance label into proof of how threatened the system is by honest voices. And she reminded everyone watching that being called a performer isn't the insult people think it is, not when the truth is undeniable. So when the dust settled, when the hearing faded from headlines and the judge finally stepped down weeks later, citing health concerns and media pressure, the official statement didn't mention Jasmine Crockett by name. But it didn't need to. Everyone knew what happened in that room. Everyone remembered the silence, and they'll remember it long after the cameras are gone. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't performing. She was telling the truth, with poise, with discipline, and with a fire they couldn't put out. And that changed everything.